Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome. This episode is a long time coming. I've been sitting with the astrology of 2025 and feeling into how I want to share about it. I felt a lot of trepidation going into this coming year talking about astrology because we are standing on the precipice of major changes in 2025. At least from an astrological perspective. The year started off intense. The first aspect we had was Pluto opposing Mars, which is no joke. And the year then proceeded to hand us Mars going retrograde. So this year is intense, right? There's no way around it. And as with everything that's intense, something that I've been learning throughout my path is that the intensity can only transform into regenerative energy, into creativity, when we give ourselves permission to sit with that intensity. Running away from the intensity doesn't really do anything. In fact, it may just add to the imagined fear that's already within our system. And so I wanted to record this episode and weave a conversation with someone that I not only trust and deeply admire, but someone whose perspectives I feel can give us a more expanded and grounded view of what the year might bring. The first person that came to mind was Kelsey Tortorice. I reached out to Kelsey and we decided to collaborate on a 2-part podcast episode discussing the astrology of 2025, and I really, really love this episode. It's deep, it's juicy. We ended up being quite philosophical and existential, which is really my favorite kind of astrological discussion. And so if you enjoy that macro view, these 2 conversations will be really nourishing. So Kelsey and I have known each other for years at this point. Kelsey gave me my first human design reading, literally back when I knew nothing about human design. And more recently, last year, Kelsey invited me to teach a guest workshop on Venus and Aquarius. So, given that the main attraction of 2025, astrologically, is that the outer planets will shift into new signs and elements, I felt like Kelsey will bring perspectives that are especially pertinent. I've always found Kelsey's perspectives to be especially insightful and incisive. And what I feel throughout the years of knowing her is that the way she talks about the outer planets shows me that she has this deep, resonant connection with these beings. And so in this episode, in part 1, we'll focus on Chiron, Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus. So Chiron and the outer planets, which are what Kelsey called the undertones. She'll explain a little bit more about this as we get into the episode. And then part 2, which is on Kelsey's podcast, the Maia Games, we'll pick up on this discussion and talk about how some of these themes are going to be carried out through the lens of Jupiter, Uranus, and the nodes, which are the midtones. And so I'll make sure to link to Kelsey's podcast and then the episode after it comes out. And so yeah, I encourage you to really check out both conversations to give you a big picture overview of some of the energies that are present and relevant for us in the coming year. Finally, before we get into the episode, I want to emphasize that, again, these discussions are really oriented towards the collective. It's really zoomed out, it's really macro. And so, for those of you who would like to go deeper into the implications on your own life, your own chart, and your own living experiments, I recommend working with an astrologer. You can work with me. I offer one-on-one consults. I'm currently offering a 2-part deep dive into your chart, into your life, into where you are currently in your journey. And you can also work with Kelsey. You can study with her. She has an incredible, robust library of materials for you to learn astrology, or you can get on her waitlist for one-on-one work. So yeah, enjoy this episode and make sure to also listen to part 2 on Kelsey's podcast, The Maia Games. Hello, Kelsey.
Hey, Jonathan. Welcome to each other's podcasts.
I'm so excited to do this with you. Thank you for doing this with me.
Yeah, same. I probably would not have ended up doing any kind of high level 2025 astrology thing had you not pulled it out
Yeah.
into the from the ethers of possibility into the uh, realm of action manifested. So thanks for thinking of me.
I could not think of anyone else. You literally were the only person who came into my mind. I came into it super late. Like, I think I reached out to you maybe the last few days of 2024, and we're only now in early February getting time to finally look at it. But at the same time, I don't know about you, but this one, the timing and the schedule feels correct to me. Like somehow it kind of feels like, given the nature of 2025, it feels right to go into it first before we start doing any sort of big picture overview. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree, but also I've been finding over the last few years that this just feels like an annual rhythm that makes sense to me. Like
Yeah, me
the
too.
first month of a year always it's Capricorn and Aquarius season, it always feels so much more kind of like retrospective and like liminal and you definitely feel the shift from Cap into Aquarius where there starts to be I read a non-astrologer author shared something a few weeks ago about is it Imbolc? Is that
Hmm.
the yeah,
Yeah,
which is like right around the sun ingress into Aquarius
yeah.
is like the belly of the spring. Like you
Mm,
start to feel kind of like pregnant with what's to come.
mm,
And so to me, that's like I've done forecasts for the year ahead before, and it's felt good, but it's felt very like intellectual and mental because you can't really like feel what's coming yet.
yeah.
So yeah, now I feel like just this last, even still, some of like Neptune and Aries, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about that because it still feels like really far, even though it's not.
Mm,
It feels
mhm.
like energetically, I'm like, what even is that?
Yes.
But in other ways, like I can maybe not astrologically necessarily, but I'm like starting to feel the vibe of what's to come in the spring. Like I can
Yeah,
feel something growing and churning. So.
yeah.
I've been, yeah, just wanting to do yearly forecasts, starting with the astrological new year, anyways. So
Hmm.
obviously, we'll talk about the full calendar year, but I could see myself in the future, like just referring to years from Aries season to Aries season, because that's what
Yeah.
tends to feel most organic for me.
That definitely feels like the real new year for me. I
Yeah.
think the Gregorian calendar new year always feels too early, and I'm always knocked out after the holiday season. And then the lunar new year feels a little bit better, like it feels like a prep, and usually the year really starts with Aries season. Yeah,
Yeah. Well,
I
and
agree.
also you're a Pisces and I'm an Aries, so like our
Mm-hmm.
own new year is also around then, it's a little
Totally.
bit into the year, so I'm sure that has a, excuse me, that plays a factor as well.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, so people had to wait a while to get this particular version of a forecast of 2025, but I think it will be worth the wait.
Yes, I'm super excited. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself, Kelsey?
Sure.
Whatever makes sense in this moment for you.
Yeah. I've been like rethinking the words that I am bio-wise because I'm
Mm.
redoing my website right now.
Mhm.
Um, okay, I'm Kelsey. I I think people know me most as like an astrology and human design teacher,
Mm.
which I am. And the phrase that it has been feeling fit for a few years to describe those things coming together in the way that I work with them is cosmic contextualizer. Also, human design wise, I'm on the cross of upheaval. So I often tend to think of myself as well as like a vessel or a talisman for upheaval. I focus a lot on deconditioning from homogenized trends and homogenized ways of seeing reality in the world and helping people like settle back into the truth of their own frequency and their own perspective. Lately, the way I tend to work with the systems together are my astrological focus is on like transit and cycles and the context of the story playing out in our individual lives and in the matrix of our shared reality. But then I more and more am like leaning towards my understanding of individual frequency via human design and the body graph as like the way that we can attune to self and filter our reality. Astrology is still a big part of how I understand that, but I've found the astrological relevance in my own practice and view lately being more about like where we are on a
Mm.
map of experience.
Mhm.
So yeah, like zooming way out and looking at the year, especially through some of the undertones, which is what we're going to focus on in this first part of our conversation, is really has felt like my wheelhouse,
Mm.
astrologically speaking. Um, Astrologically speaking, also, I'm Aries, Sun, Mercury, Venus, Sag, Moon, and Rising, and then chart ruler Jupiter, as well as Mars, the ruler of my Aries stellium, in Gemini. So I'm a lot of air and fire. North Node in Pisces,
Mm.
so I'm at a pivotal moment in my own nodal journey right now. Excited to talk about this nodal transit with you in the next
Yeah.
part. And then human design, I'm a 5-2 emotional manifester.
Mm. Cool.
Yeah.
I love that introduction. Also, I feel so inspired just sitting in the space with you and hearing you talk. So
You
I
are
want to name
so,
that.
so kind and gracious all the time. Thank you.
It's
Very
true,
gentle.
though. It's true. It's true. I only say it because I mean it. My name's Jonathan. I live in New York City. I live in Brooklyn currently. Um, I like leading with that because I feel very connected to this place and I feel very in love with New York City. Um, that's not always been true, but in the past year, I felt a lot of gratitude for this place. I like Kelsey, do astrology. I mostly do one-on-ones. I occasionally do courses as well and group experiences. And like Kelsey, I also have been thinking about like exactly what I do and the term that I want to use to describe what I do. And I've been calling myself a lunar thinker. I find I have Gemini moon on my midheaven. And I find that a lot of what I do is kind of thinking alongside the planets. And when I'm in client sessions, like thinking alongside another person um, with the help of the context of the planets and also thinking with the rest of the body. I found recently that reclaiming the word thinker has been really helpful for me because actually that is what I do. Um, I was born under the right angle cross of consciousness, and I do a lot of kind of integrating work between, you know, my own past and the present and what that means for the future. And I do that with clients as well. And kind of thinking of the other day, I had a teacher said something that really resonated with me. She said, time is not outside of us, time, like we are time. And
Mm.
that's something that really I've been thinking about and feeling into a lot. So, yeah, I'm a 3-5 sacral generator. I am a Virgo rising, Pisces sun, and Gemini moon, like I mentioned. And my notes are in Aquarius, Leo. So, yeah.
I got like a strong hit when you said lunar thinker of what it meant to me, and then
Mm.
hearing you articulate it was cool because it was like pretty much the same thing, but coming from a different place. Like the idea of kind of taking back the word thinker. First of all, is really resonant for me
Mm.
personally
Hmm.
lately as well, but also just gave me this feeling of like re reintegrating body and mind in a
Mm.
way,
Yeah.
which feels like it must be very necessary for a Gemini moon.
Yeah, definitely. I also think we're in an interesting moment in history, which we're not going to fully get into today, but thinking about the 2027 human design prophecy, for lack of a better term, um, I do think that we're kind of, as we're recording this right now, we're in a moment of transitioning to another way of being, or even like another way of working with our frequency, as human beings. And I think our minds, because in this previous era, our minds have been so well cultivated and well developed, I think that our mind actually is such a beautiful portal or entryway into whatever it is that we're going to get jazzy about in the future.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Bookmarking that concept for when we start talking about Uranus and Gemini, trine Pluto and Aquarius.
Yep.
Yeah.
So before we actually dive in, Kelsey, can we maybe talk a little bit about how we're organizing this? So we're doing
Yeah.
part one today and part two later, and
Yeah.
on a separate episode. Yeah.
Right. Yes. So, we both have music backgrounds prior to astrology, right? For me, I think like my music brain a couple years ago inspired a way that I think about timing and transits, specifically on a collective level. So, specifically when I'm looking at like this time period for human evolution and human consciousness. And the way that I started to think about it was like, I don't think this is necessarily revolutionary. I think a lot of astrologers think of it this way, but it just like cemented via a musical metaphor in my mind is that the slower moving planets, so the ones we're going to focus on more on this part one episode, Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, and sometimes Chiron, are I refer to them as like an undertone. I say sometimes Chiron because Chiron, depending on where it is in the zodiac, can spend anywhere from 1 to like 9 years in a single sign,
Mm-hmm.
and Chiron's in Aries, moving very slow right now. So I call those four planets like the undertones, and they feel almost like a drone to me. Like this is a note, or when you put them all together, like a chord being played all the way to the left of the piano, like in the low frequencies, that's just holding down a certain feeling, a certain tone, a certain texture of the human experience, or a certain kind of theme within the cosmic curriculum. And then as you get into the faster moving planets, the ones that we'll largely focus on in part two, so Saturn, Jupiter, the nodes, maybe some Mars, we're dealing with like a more shifting melody that's taking those undertones and bringing them to the forefront of our experience in a particular way that changes a little more frequently. And
Mm.
then when you start talking about the luminaries and Mercury and Venus and Mars kind of to me floats between those upper tones and those midtones. You're dealing with more like the day to day, the week to week, the month to month, and how those midtones and those lower tones are carried forward to the most conscious part of our minds, the where the most like quick activity is taking place.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we're not going to be talking very linearly, especially today. I wonder if maybe in part two we might naturally arrive to a more linear way of thinking about the year. I don't know. I'm never very linear when it comes to looking at astrology.
Me neither.
Um, but yeah, we're going to just today focus on talking about in the order that these lower tones arrived to where they are,
Hmm.
what Chiron and Aries has felt like for the last 7 years, and what we might experience with Chiron and Aries, for example, in 2025 as it's nearing the end of its time
Yeah.
in that sign, and then how Pluto and Neptune, which Pluto is firmly established in Aquarius now, so we'll talk about that. And then Neptune, the shift from Pisces into Aries, and then Uranus, the shift from Taurus into Gemini, and how those four undertones feel as a composite throughout these different parts of the year, where there is a little bit. It almost feels like what is it called in music? I've forgotten a lot of my music metaphors, where like one note of the chord shifts before the rest. Is that like an anticipation? Is that what we refer to that as? Doesn't matter. Open
Can
head
be.
problem.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it feels like the chord, that undertone chord actually changes quite
Yeah.
significantly this
Yeah.
year,
Yeah.
whereas last year it didn't. Last year it was Pluto, so that was significant. It was changing, but this year two of those undertones make a pretty
Yeah.
big shift. So
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
focus of today's convo. Is there
Yes.
anything you want to add to that kind of like zoomed out framing of how we're approaching this two-parter?
I think what I will say about the movement of the um, undertones is the shift is not only by sign, but it's also by element, which feels really significant to me. You know, we have Neptune moving from Pisces to Aries, and even just thinking about, you know, this kind of oceanic body of water shifting from a water sign, right, into a fire sign. That's a very different energy. Like it's going from like Sailor Moon, like watching Sailor Moon to like watching Dragon Ball, you
Mm-hmm.
know, like a very different vibe,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Totally.
And yeah, and to have a year where all the kind of outer planets are transitioning to a different sign, it's really, I mean, that's big astrological news, you know. And I think also for me personally, that's part of why it hasn't felt totally right to talk about the big picture, because it almost feels like we need to, in order to understand them, we have to be a different person. Like we have to inhabit a different way of being.
Mm,
And it felt to me like January was preparing us to be able to talk about it a little bit more,
mm.
you know?
Yeah, totally. We were still in the early stages of assimilating
Yeah.
the last year in January. We're still in assimilation, but we're starting to feel the tonal shift a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. These particular sign to sign shifts and elemental shifts feel so significant. Like one of the tones we'll talk about near the end of the convo is the Uranus shift from Taurus to Gemini, and any shift from Taurus to Gemini feels so significant to me because it's fixed earth to mutable
Mm.
air. So like going from the most dense fixicity to the least,
Mm.
right? And I kind of
Mhm.
feel that way about kind of all the way from like Pisces to Gemini, maybe even Pisces to Cancer, but especially Pisces to Gemini, like that quarter.
Mm.
Every shift feels so significant. Like
Yeah.
once you get to Cancer to Leo, Leo to Virgo, Virgo to Libra, you're still getting the elemental and modal change.
Mm.
But for me, when I feel into that, it feels, you can feel like the sequence and the fluidity. Like you can feel what Cancer and Leo have in common. They're both ruled
Yeah.
by luminaries. You can feel
Mm.
what Leo and Virgo have in common. They both have a lot to do with like agency to me. But
Mm-hmm.
when you're going from Pisces to Aries, like that's huge. Aries to Taurus, huge. Like Aries is extremely disembodied, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then so yeah, these shifts in particular feel huge, and the fact that it's our most undertones, our long drones that are making these shifts between Pisces to Gemini, certainly significant.
Yeah.
And I understand why astrologers have been looking at this year and are speaking with such gusto about the
Mm-hmm.
shifts this year.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Shall we get
Let's
into
do
it,
it.
Kelsey? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, okay, we're going to start with Chiron, which I loved the idea that you had, Jonathan, to focus kind of sequentially on which of these undertones arrived to their station
Mm-hmm.
for their drone first. That's not how I was thinking about it, but I love thinking about it that way. And especially so because you mentioned like all of these undertones are in a moment of transition, except Chiron,
Mm-hmm.
actually. So
Yeah.
even though Chiron is the fastest moving of all of these planets that we're talking about today, it's the one that's been where it is the longest. So
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways for 2025, Chiron is the ultimate undertone because we're still like fresh in Pluto Aquarius, establishing it after 20 years of it in a different sign, right? So it still feels pretty fresh. And then Neptune and Gemini or Neptune and Uranus are shifting this year. So big changes.
Mm-hmm.
But Chiron is actually the note in the chord that we can depend on, that we know
Mm.
quite well, because Chiron's been in Aries for a while. Um, Give me a second to get my Chiron and Aries notes in front of me here. So Chiron has been in Aries since uh, the spring and summer of 2018. That's when it first dipped into Aries. So we're going on 7 years and finally ingressed into Aries to stay in February of 2019. So we're pretty established with this. And I'm just going to kind of read some of my notes on Chiron as a way for all of us, you and I, and listeners to calibrate to what exactly are we talking about here. But
Mm.
yeah, I'm responsible for introducing Chiron today, but I'd love to hear your thoughts too, Jonathan, on even just like how you think about Chiron before we
Yeah.
even talk about Chiron and Aries. But I would sum up Chiron's general planetary significance as being about the undertone of our wounds around abandonment.
Mm.
People talk about Chiron as the wounded healer, which I'll get to. But the wound with Chiron in particular to me feels to be about the wound of aloneness and the wound of separation. Something that's also been really useful for me in understanding Chiron as far as I do right now is this concept of Chiron being like the bridge between Saturn and Uranus.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto being the outers, and some modern, especially astrologers, myself included, think about the outers as being like these more subtle ethereal textures of our experience versus then Saturn and inwards has to do with some of the more tangible 3D aspects of what it is to be human and to be
Yeah.
incarnated in this realm. And Chiron kind of floats in between. And the fact that Chiron sometimes spends 9 years in a sign, like when it's in Aries right now, and then
Mm.
only 1 year about when it's at the opposite side of the zodiac in Libra, is significant to me for so many reasons. But one of those is that it kind of validates this idea that Chiron is a bridge between the more tangible aspects of our human experience, Saturn and inwards, and the less tangible ones, Uranus and outwards. So we can think about like the healer part of Chiron that initiates us into those more subtle, less tangible, maybe outer dimensional aspects of human consciousness. It does so through highlighting our wounded experience in the more mundane, the more tangible, the more third dimensional aspects. So it initiates us into the outers through addressing our deepest wounds, which often have to do with rejection, abandonment, and neglect. And Chiron takes about 50 years to move through the zodiac. And I found it to be extremely interesting that it spends the longest amount of time in Aries,
Mm.
followed by Pisces and Taurus. And then as you get away from Aries and towards Libra, its opposite sign, it spends the least amount of time. And once I like saw that and understood that and felt that, for me, that felt so significant because it shows me that in order for us to experience this initiation into whatever Uranus, Neptune, Pluto mean to people, whatever this extra dimensional, extra sensory, more subtle realm means to people, in order for us to experience that initiation, we have to spend a lot of time dealing with wounds, in particular around the terrain of Aries,
Mm.
which to me is the place where separation exists, right? Because
Yeah.
if we think about the shift from Pisces to Aries, which we'll also talk about today from the vantage point of Neptune, but just in general, zodiacally, Pisces is where there is no boundaries, there is no time, there is no space, there is no separation.
Yeah.
And in Aries, there's a very intentional, it's Mars ruled, right? So there's like an intent, a drive to separate, to go have an individuated experience of self. A metaphor that I use a lot is like we get bored being in the cosmic soup of the oversoul, even though that's where ultimate love exists and true perfection exists. It gets boring. So souls go, I need to go have a separate experience and choose to separate and take on the violence and the grief and the harm that separation actually is for a reason. I often say, people say the illusion of separation, right? That's one way to talk about what the Maya is. And I like to add the word as an Aries, perhaps, the intentional illusion of separation. Like, yes, we came here to have separate experiences. And yes, there's a lot of pain built into that, but we did that on purpose. We did it for a reason.
Yeah.
And so I think this, for me, this Chiron and Aries transit has been a lot about like being willing to embrace separation in a way and like facing the pain that we experience as humans who are in some way forever, however consciously or not, forever tethered to the truth of the fact that we are not actually separate. And so the pain, like the need to face the world every day as an individual being can be so painful because we have this like longing to be reconnected. Chiron is asking us to really face that and look at that pain and address that pain and honor that pain and transmute and alchemize that pain so that we can continue to move forward in our separateness, which is what was intended. And our separateness is a quality of our
Mm.
connectedness. Our separateness is it's a means to our connection as well. So that's one way that I tend to think about Chiron, but also Chiron and Aries in general. The phrase that I bring up a lot when I'm referring to this transit is how are you abandoning yourself for
Mm.
fear of being abandoned by the other?
Mm.
Like, how are you dismissing the sanctity of your separateness and your
Yeah.
uniqueness? And in
That's a big
one,
one.
yeah, it's
Hmm.
huge. It's been the curriculum for a while, right? And
Yeah.
so if I think about where we are as a collective, and when I say we, I think I'm thinking about my own like personal process in terms of relationship and interconnectedness and interdependence versus codependency. But I'm also thinking about kind of like the themes and narratives and lessons that I've seen. I want to say the collective, but I would probably be more aptly articulated to say like my sphere, the
Mm.
people who are kind of like in my world talking about reality in a similar way to me. I've seen a lot of focus on like early in the transit, it was a lot of focus on like boundaries.
Mm. Hmm.
I think that was like when we had nodes in Capricorn Cancer too. That felt like a lot of boundary work. And now it's like it still feels like that, but it really does feel to me like the we that I referred to have progressed a lot through this lesson where we know things about codependency. We have more awareness of codependency and like the subtle ways that codependency and coercion and guilt and obligation had shown up in regards to how we relate to each other and what we expect from each other and what we kind of perceive that other people owe us and we owe them.
Mm,
I still
mhm.
feel like there's those undertones of codependency are still like pretty deeply ingrained, but I feel like I've witnessed in myself and a lot of other people actually quite a bit of healing already take place in
Yeah.
regards to the willingness and capacity to like be honest with oneself about their own nature and their own desires and their own separate perspective and experience and be less capable and willing and to like compulsively minimize those things for the sake of trying to create a facade of connection to meet
Yeah.
others' expectations and
Yeah.
even like more of an awareness around projection and
Mhm.
expectations and the fact that everybody is just on their own journey and for us to decide or believe the narrative that this person who isn't able to meet our expectations is wrong is so naive, in fact,
Mm,
because who are we to say that what we wish that they were for us or how we wish they treated us or looked at us or thought of us? Like that has nothing to do with them. That's our journey, right? And so again, just kind of refocusing on the truth of our separation and being willing to honor that part of the truth because it is
mhm.
also I tend to think of the water signs as being the parts of truth that remind us of our ultimate connection.
Mm,
And the fire signs always follow the water signs. And to me, the fire signs have a lot to do with honoring the part of truth that is our separation and our individuality.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's like my high level overview of what Chiron and Aries feels like. And Chiron remains in Aries for all of 2025 and won't start to dip back or into Taurus until I think a little bit in 2026 and then 2027. I didn't write that
Mhm.
down. But yeah, how have you been tuning into this transit and what comes up for you around Chiron and Aries?
As you were speaking, I'm thinking about how, there were a couple things. One was I just wanted to kind of highlight or underline your point, which may be obvious to some listening, but I feel like Chiron is that place that tends to the wound, but in tending to the wound, then brings out the gifts. More, what do you call it? Like more externally. Like Chiron to me is beyond just looking at the wound. Chiron is the process of transmute transmutational transmutationally turning the wound into medicine. So that's the first thing that came up. The other thing that came up too when you were speaking was um, how the process of individuating and recognizing our own desires, our own individuality actually shifts our relationships, right? And the qualities of our relationships and the energetics of that relationship itself. Um, Something that I've been thinking about too with Chiron and Aries is how there seems to be kind of a split where, if someone has been doing or a group of people have been doing the work to kind of reclaim their agency, their sovereignty and recognizing like, their own wounds of abandonment and tending to that wounds of abandonment, there's such on the other side of it, there can be like this mutation that happens, like people becoming more deeply aligned in relationship in ways that they may not have even been aware of before. So, for example, what I'm going to bring in here is the idea of like finding resonance with people, right? You know, the old paradigm of like friendship or thinking about connection is this paradigm of like loyalty, right? Like if I'm friends with this person, I'm supposed to behave a certain way, this person is supposed to respond a certain way, and we're going to be friends forever, with this kind of stuck way of looking at relationships, right?
Mm,
But I think with Chiron and Aries, what's been coming up is this idea of like, oh, rather than judging friends, the real question is like, what kind of friendship do I want right now? And is this person available for that kind of connection, right? And then, kind of in a non-judgmental way, moving fluidly between different relationships. Uh, just to ground it in like something that listeners may actually know about, it's making me think of the idea of relationship anarchy, and
Hmm.
also, a lot of people exploring polyamory and
Hmm.
ethical polyamory and what that
Yes.
actually looks like, because in those larger networks of humans kind of relating with one another, one is forced to really look at the quality of the relationship itself rather than resorting to preset ideas of what that relationship needs to look like. And I think when I'm tuning into Chiron and Aries as the first of these undertones that we're going into 2025 with, I think there's an even deeper exploration into that. Like,
Yes.
rather than thinking about, like, for example, our friendship, Kelsey, like rather than thinking of it as like these are the list of this is the laundry list of things that friends are supposed to do for one another. This is who Kelsey is. This is who I am. And this is who Kelsey is in relationship to Jonathan, and vice versa. And then we kind of co-create a
Hmm.
container that actually feels nourishing to both of us.
Yeah,
Does that kind of feel like,
that makes so much sense. And even
yeah,
like I would even add to that, this is who Kelsey is today. This is who Jonathan is today. This is what Kelsey and Jonathan's connection looks like today. Like I
yeah,
think one of the themes that you're bringing in, did you use the word impermanence?
I
Either
did
you
not
use
use,
that word.
yeah.
Okay, I wrote down Gemini impermanence.
Hmm.
And I think this feels like an Aries Gemini sextile vibe to me, like how Aries and
Yeah.
Gemini empower one another, which
Hmm.
I am kind of referring to this as like a significant texture I bring as an Aries and a significant texture you bring with your Gemini moon, but also Jerry's Gemini Aries sextile is loud in the astrology in 2025.
Yeah.
Jupiter starts the year in Gemini.
Mm.
Uranus mid-year will move into Gemini. So we've been getting in 2024 and we will continue to get in a different flavor in 2025 the support of Gemini's value of impermanence to continue to work through this Chiron and Aries wound. So like experiencing safety and love and validation via relationship and via connection can be an extremely impermanent thing.
Mm.
Like, we don't need to decide for certain who our people are.
Yeah.
What is actually supportive, what I have found in my own experience, which is backed up by these cosmic languages that I study of astrology and human design, is that if I cultivate that sense of security within through over and over again learning to revere nature as it differentiatedly shows up within me, then
Mm.
I can experience safety and reverence for self and love and acceptance for self wherever I go because I'm not expecting or distorting the truth of what's showing up in a connection between myself and another person in order to
Yeah.
establish a more like a false, more superficial version of safety and connection. So it's like, what if you actually never could be abandoned
Mm.
because you always have yourself and
Yeah.
you have this like inherent understanding that just by nature of existing, by nature of being incarnated here, you have value and you are
Mm.
a unique representative of love. To me,
Yeah.
that's like the medicine
Yeah.
in the Chiron and Aries wound. And yeah, and then we're not expecting so much out of other people. Then we're not putting the task of validating one's existence on relationships. And
Hmm.
then we get to actually experience that validation in a really pure form, however fleeting, but in all these different ways. Every time you and
Hmm.
I connect, the more that we are relaxed into the present and into embodying whatever is true about ourselves that day, the more we get to experience some kind of really deep, profound, and always changing version of love.
Yes.
Right? So what if we can't be abandoned
Mm.
because we always have ourself, you know? That's kind of the
Yeah.
medicine. of
Yeah.
it to me. And I'm also really drawn to what you brought up at the start of your share about kind of the split. I think sometimes I'm afraid to acknowledge both privately, internally, and out loud
Mm,
my own observation of that because
mm,
it's so easy to get into like a hierarchical superiority thing around it.
absolutely.
But it's
Yeah.
also, it also is a part of me denying a true part of my actual perception. So I'm
Hmm.
glad you brought it up. Like, it's like there's this medicine of then experiencing connection more honestly and true and I think it's maybe not that black and white and maybe that's also part of why I like refrain from talking about it sometimes because the and or exists in all of us to some
Yeah.
extent, you know.
Absolutely.
But and or we're like doubling down on that wound of
Hmm.
separation and we're doubling
Yeah.
down on the complex
Yeah.
that we've created to protect us from feeling like we might be abandoned, and that
Hmm.
might manifest as like continuing to other, right? Which is
Hmm.
where we see like people doubling down on like their political ideations, for example, doubling down on like literally
Victimization.
neglecting victimization and literally, yeah, their victimization causing them to then literally neglect and abandon others. And
Hmm.
projection, right? Just having so
Yeah.
many of our own stories that then completely dictate how we're perceiving reality rather than
Hmm.
loosening the grasp on our victimhood and loosening the grasp on our own narrative in order to be
Yeah.
able to honor our narrative while also remaining open to the narratives and the perspectives and the lives of other people. So
Yeah.
that's really interesting to me. And I think being so Sagittarian and tending to want to look at the silver lining, I sometimes just am not that organically drawn to this part of it. But I do think some of that doubling down is obviously has already been amplified, and we'll probably see that continuing to be amplified into 2025. So it's like
Yeah.
the parts of us as individuals and as a collective that are like, quote, doing the work and looking at this stuff with humility and like love and opening our hearts are going to continue to move in that direction. And the parts of us as individuals, maybe, but especially as a collective that are not and are remaining in a state of denial and victimhood and blaming and othering, that shit's probably going to get louder too. And Neptune and Aries
Hmm.
is not going to help.
Yeah. No. I I want to add one more note on the experience of victimhood and victimization that has recently shown up in my field, where I noticed that there is, first of all, I think when we hear it, or at least when I hear it talked about in like Western psychological circles, it almost feels like that's kind of a permanent state, right? Like, oh, someone just sees themselves as a victim forever and ever. And one thing I've been noticing recently, and I think this is also a Chiron and Aries phenomenon, is when one party is like in that state, if they come into contact with another party who is already moved beyond the victimhood stories, but not go into this like superiority complex, but rather just kind of be in that state of presence and grace, the transmutation that's available is like really quick, which I think is also another Aries signature. Like these energies can be transformed so quickly and almost like very seamlessly with a lot of innocence and fun. So,
Oh,
mhm.
so true. Like just this notion that sometimes is a cliche. It feels like a cliche because it can feel hollow, but
Hmm.
it's not hollow. The notion of like simply by being yourself, you can like expedite the healing and the
Yeah,
self-acceptance of others. That's such an
yeah,
Aries notion.
right, right. Yeah.
Hmm. And it's like when we stop trying to prove our own validity and we just carry that connection to a sense of our own validity around with us, it interrupts that deeply ingrained defensiveness that
Yeah.
we all tend to like flail at each other. And also, as fifth lines, I think we know this well too. Like, if we can remain regulated and calm and tapped into our own truth and our own perspective in the face of like receiving absurd and sometimes violent projections, this isn't always the case, but often I don't know if it always disarms the person
Mm.
projecting. Sometimes it
Mm-hmm.
does, and that's the best. But at the very least, I think it tends to show
Mm.
the person projecting that a little more, whether they consciously grasp this or not,
Yeah.
that this is them, this is their stuff, because I'm not playing the game with you now.
Yes.
So regardless of like whether or not you get that immediate disarming and that immediate connection, there's something subtle happening
Yeah.
in our interactions when one party shows up with a strong sense of self validity. Because when you feel
Mm-hmm.
valid as a self, you don't feel the need to invalidate the other.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
So this is something we've been all this Chiron and Aries stuff we've been working on collectively since 2019, 2018, 2019, which also of note, the isolation factor of COVID, this worldwide
Mm.
thing that happened,
Yeah.
was 1 year, like as Chiron was 1 year after Chiron was firmly rooted in Aries. So I've also thought a lot about like, I know not everybody fully isolated, but like everybody got some flavor of what's it like to be a bit more self-contained, to be a little less out there in the field of mixing energies. And so I think that there was a probably a big shift collectively in just like the attunement to one's own frequency, which to varying levels then made people a bit more sensitive to what it's like
Mm.
when my frequency meets the other.
Yeah.
And I think that's been like a tangible example of some Chiron and Aries shifts. And
Yeah.
so that's been being played out and continues to be played out in 2025. And even though it's not the longest transit of these undertones, it's the one that we're most familiar with as a collective. So it does kind of set us up for then these other transits that we'll talk
Yes.
about.
Yes. Hmm. Shall we move on to Pluto and Aquarius?
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's do
Cool.
it.
So Pluto in Aquarius is also another one of those transits that we came into the year with, right? The only, we're no stranger to Pluto in Aquarius. The first ingress of Pluto going into Aquarius happened in March 2023. And we've been solidly experiencing Pluto in Aquarius, meaning Pluto no longer dips back and forth between Aquarius and Capricorn since November 2024, right? So this is nothing new, but the only difference really is that Pluto is no longer going to be dipping back into Capricorn. And I got curious about the historical precedent of this, and I found out that the last time Pluto was in Aquarius was 1777 to 1778. And as a musician, um, it reminded me that that was right in the middle of Mozart's life. That was when Mozart was just turning 20-ish. I think he was born in 1756, so he would be 21, 22. 1777 was also right in the midst of the American Revolutionary War, and Congress declared the Stars and Stripes flag for the US. I just thought that was really interesting. And maybe those listening can start making connections and correlations to like what we're currently experiencing right now, both in the world stage and in the US. And when I think about Pluto, I think about transformation. I think about death and decay. I think about that which is hidden. I think about that which is minuscule that either, can have really um, vast and powerful impact, or that which is so minuscule that is often forgotten, that in us forgetting about the small thing, it becomes a big problem, right? But
Mm.
in any case, Pluto like has great impact without necessarily having a large size or like being the loudest in the room. Like sometimes it's like that idea of, silence. Um, who was it? I was listening to like a motivational speaker the other day, and they were talking about like being decisive, like, and they said something about how the decisive person is the person who did nothing for 59 minutes in an hour and then
Mm.
decided to do something in the last minute, or like within 1 minute, right? And that vibe to me is very Plutonian. Now, when we're
Mm.
thinking about Aquarius, I was thinking about, obviously Aquarius is associated with things like technology, right? It's associated with extraterrestrial life, and it also is associated with belonging. So this idea of like who's the insider, who's the outsider, right? The idea of who fits in, like the idea of immigrants, borders, tariffs, are obviously, now that we're recording in February, we know that these are really alive in kind of the collective conversation, right? For everyone globally. And to go back to this idea of extraterrestrial life, I've been thinking about how even the concept of like an alien, right, is a concept that we made up. We defined, right, in order for us to have uh someone or a group of people or a group of beings that we call an alien, we have to necessarily have people who are not aliens and who belong as humans, right? So I think this question around like what it even means for us to be human is going to be big
Mm.
in Pluto and Aquarius. I think this is kind of a deep exploration that we're going to be doing in the roughly, next couple decades, right? Aquarius is also associated with mindset, with perspectives, with frame of reference, with the idea of ontology, right? Meaning like what's real and what's not real. And yeah, something that I was thinking about, maybe the last thing I'll say before I hand over the mic to you, Kelsey, is I think a lot about Pluto and Aquarius as related to actually thinking about power.
Mm.
Because something that I think about with Aquarius is how Aquarius is when the goat has reached the top, right, of the mountain. We can relate this to late stage capitalism. We can relate this to, the kind of crumbling of the empire and the empire mindset, right? Like we've gotten to a point, we can even relate this to the cross of planning in human design, right? We've gotten to the apex of that which we've been building towards for a very long time. And now that we're at the peak, we can have a better view of like what that building process, what that process of like going up the mountain has led us into, and I think we're presented with a moment of choice of like, do we want to continue with this or do we want to shift? Is there another reality that's possible? um the idea of like world building, for example, to me is very Aquarian and very much probably going to be very alive with Pluto and Aquarius. And in reverse, thinking too about like what is the consequence of individuals not creating the world that they do want to build, or the world that they know is authentic to them.
Yeah. Wow. Something new popping into my head from listening is like you referenced power dynamics in a way that's kind of Aquarius specific. And then, of course, power is one of the ways, one of the qualities of Pluto as well, like
Mhm.
unveiling the centralization of power,
Yeah.
and unveiling like the power dynamics that have perhaps existed under the surface, which we definitely saw in a particular way with Pluto and Capricorn, specific to how power was showing up in this like physically manifested form of society, right? And governments. Um, so that's just, yeah, that's something that's swirling in my mind as like Aquarius represents power in a way as well through this theme that you talked about of like belonging and allyship, right? And
Mm.
like, um, yeah, power in kind of a where does, how does power, uh, how can power form when it has to do with this like decentralization of the masses? Like, where's the collective mind at? and the
Yeah.
power through that. So I'm just seeing this like Venn diagram in my, I don't really have a point right now, but just getting this Venn diagram of like how Pluto represents power and the way we see power show up in
Mhm.
Aquarius, and how every Pluto transit is about power, but there's something particular about it
Yeah.
with Pluto and Aquarius.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing is like I saw a lot of examples, or I heard a lot of examples in what you shared of like how I tend to think about Pluto and Aquarius in just a like universal thread way, which is I think about Pluto as like this force of decimation that
Mm.
destroys something. It like
Yeah.
destroys it. It is a rebirth through the decimation of what was.
Yeah.
And Aquarius, to me, fixed air, the final air sign of the zodiac, its phrase is I know,
Mm.
right? And so it's what we know or think
Mhm.
we know
Yeah.
the most.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this quality of like the minimal, you know, Pluto taking what's so small that we may have forgotten it. That is so resonant to how I've been thinking about Pluto in Aquarius since I like forecasted it for 2024,
Mhm.
which is like it's the decimation of what we know, like what we think we know as a collective species, our understanding of mind, like
Mm.
science is a very kind of Aquarian theme, right? Like how do
Yeah.
we think things work? And it's not necessarily about material reality anymore. So there's something with Pluto and Aquarius about like transcending. Like I was picturing like you get to the top of the mountain in Capricorn, and then in Aquarius it's like you're not coming down the mountain the other side. You're like maybe getting up on a rocket ship and going out to outer space. Like we're leaving the mountain.
Yeah.
I sometimes think of Aquarius and Capricorn as like the sides of Saturn. So like
Mm.
Capricorn is the part of Saturn facing inwards, looking at the
Mhm.
rest of the solar system and the planet.
Yeah.
And Aquarius is the side of Saturn looking outward. Again, it's the last of the physically visible signs. So it's
Mhm.
ushering us in a way towards the outers, the
Yeah.
other dimensional aspects of
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
So I think like looking at scientific materialism as a thing of the past is
Mm.
probably something that's going to happen during this Pluto
Mhm.
and Aquarius era. Like the hive mind is going to become more and more oriented to a different way of scientific understanding. Like
Mm.
science in the last era either dismissed or refused to investigate, which I guess is just another form of dismissal, any understanding or experimentation that couldn't be proven on the material realm.
Mhm.
And I think science in the new era may not. Like we might not have the ability to dismiss that anymore. Or, but I don't know. I was also thinking as you were talking, like that theme that you brought up with Chiron and Aries that I then labeled doubling down.
Mm.
I think that's
Mhm.
probably likely to happen with the revelations of Pluto and Aquarius as well. So
Very much so.
kind of people talk about this as like science catching up to spirituality, or like science and spirituality, that line getting more blurred.
Mhm.
I think that is what is organic to probably human evolution, period, but especially at this particular point. And I don't necessarily think that like the what we currently perceive as the powers that be, whether we're talking about, you know, government, academia, I don't think we're going to continue to perceive those things as the powers that be as a collective. I think that's part of Pluto and Aquarius, that
Mm.
decentralization of power.
Yeah.
But I do think that there will still remain nexuses of like shared realities where scientific materialism is doubled down on.
Yeah.
But I think for many of us, there's just going to be these like undeniable advancements in what we understand through shatterings of what we thought we knew. That many of us are just going to be like the same way in Pluto and in Capricorn, there was like not enough to tip the scales quite yet, but there were mass divestments from the structures,
Yeah.
collective structures.
Yeah.
That's going to be happening on the mental plane. So, what we
Mhm.
know intellectually as a species, as a collective mind, there's going to be mass divestments from the old way of looking at things. And so, we're
Yeah.
talking about like, I mean, for me, this was like years ago, I started to see personal context, this was when I think this was when Jupiter was in Pisces for which is my IC and my North Node, is when I started to like really actually look at what I understood, what I thought things like aliens were, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
like, because again, that's a construct, right? And it's when I started to really actually think about like dimensions, like not just as this like concept out there that
Mm-hmm.
I have heard about but took for granted, but actually process for myself. Like, what does it mean to be extraterrestrial? What does it
Right.
mean to be other dimensional? And then my understanding of both those things morphed into the same, you know? So
Mm.
for me now, like spirits, guides, aliens, like I don't know that I could articulate exactly what it is, but I have a felt understanding internally that is so different from
Yeah.
how I used to think about those things. And
Yeah.
so I see um, more of that on a collective level. Like, and you already can see it, right? You see like
Mm-hmm.
some of these concepts that years ago would have felt extremely out there still feel extremely out there to some people, but to people like us, people in our sphere, where some of this language is used more and we understand what we mean now in a way that is really different, I think, to how we were
Mm.
talking about consciousness and aliens five,
Yeah.
10 years ago.
Absolutely. I think you brought up a really good point, Kelsey. I want to point out two things here. The first one is you're making me think of something somebody was telling me the other day about the kind of global shift of consumer spending patterns where people were, prior to COVID used to be really, really into items, right? Into like luxury goods and things like that. And in the past few years, we've noticed the shift from spending on items or kind of markers of status more into experiences. And I'm not talking about, it obviously depends on like which circle you're currently moving within, right? This is not kind of a uniform thing, but I think overall we see a greater propensity for people to like want to have experiences, like travel, for example, becoming something that um, kind of exploded after the pandemic and people realizing like they would rather spend time with their loved ones um, in a place that feels really special or having certain kinds of experiences rather than spending a lot of money buying things, right? Um, and then the other piece you mentioned, let me see if I can retrieve it because it's leaving my mind right now. Ugh, I'm sad when this happens. But tell me a little bit more about what you were saying towards the end there about, I think you're muted.
Oops, sorry. Yeah, like science and
Oh,
mind and
yeah.
like the to me, Pluto and Aquarius, if I just really sum it up, what I think Pluto is and what I think Aquarius is, it's the decimation of what we think we know. So just a
Mm,
whole paradigmatic shift around how we understand reality
yeah,
and shifting it away from scientific materialism and more towards like
yeah,
the telepathy tapes is talking about this. Are you
exactly.
familiar with that?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
Kai is like well, let me just say I'm like a little bit I think it's a really cool podcast. I'm listening to it and it's impacting me for sure. And
Mm,
also there's a kind of a take on that podcast that like it is totally revelatory that scientific materialism might not be it.
mm.
And that's not revelatory, right? Like there's cultures and people who have seen reality beyond materialism forever.
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
just want to point that out.
yeah,
But
yeah.
also, I think like the nexus of thought, which is
Mm,
often what Pluto represents and Aquarius in its own way,
yeah, yeah,
is
yeah.
going to shift.
Exactly. You're reminding me, okay, so this is great because telepathy tapes is such a great example of this, which is when you were talking earlier about conversations around aliens or like spirits and guides landing differently on a frequency level, even for, people like you and I who are talking about this kind of stuff all day with people. I'm thinking about how Pluto and Aquarius, I think, is going to inevitably lead people to like people like us, who have been thinking about consciousness, thinking about things like astrology, to um in a way not necessarily dumbing it down or watering it down or toning it down, but making more of a concerted effort to be able to be understood by people who are outside of this field. I feel like, especially for people who are kind of spiritual people, or let's just put this really horribly phrase umbrella of like spiritual workers, like spiritual workers finding ways to actually be able to create bridges rather than use their spiritual practices and identity as a way to validate themselves and to separate themselves from kind of the collective. Because I think that's something that, to go back to kind of stitch this back to Chiron and Aries, I think for a lot of us, maybe this is also like having to do with like our age, right? But a lot of us kind of in the millennial age bracket embrace spirituality as an identity concept. But I think the people who continue doing this work and continue to find resonance in it will need to figure out how to move beyond just the identity marker or just the kind of validation of our outsiderness
Mm-hmm.
into like actually using these tools
Mm.
to make real changes.
Is this not the Pluto in Aquarius square by transit to our natal Pluto? Right? Like there's some kind of
Yes.
like tension and something that needs to be worked through in order to make
Yeah.
us more agile
Yeah.
at the thing we're here to do,
Yeah.
which that to me that's a square.
Yeah.
Um, that like ultimate agility through tension.
Hmm.
And yeah, part of what was coming up for me too is like I'm sure there will be conscious efforts as you're articulating it, but I also am wondering if like are the circumstances of reality just going to make it so that the lessons that we want to offer, we being maybe the millennial spiritual worker umbrella that you're loosely drawing, but are those lessons just going to become more relevant? So like a lot of our what we have been trying to say might have felt like it's falling on deaf ears to a different
Mm.
subset of the population.
Yeah.
And again, not to say that all millennials would
Are
even be
into
able
it.
to track the conversation you and I are having right now, you know.
True.
Um, a lot of people who won't listen to this, but there's probably a lot of people who would, if they did listen to this, would be hearing like blah 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 blah, you know. But like if I think about Pluto and Capricorn as a way of relating to what Pluto and Aquarius might be, and this idea that you had of that you brought forth of like it makes these things that are small bigger.
Mm.
I sometimes feel like what the Pluto transits show us is what we had been taking what we had been ignoring. And another way of talking about ignoring is like taking for granted,
Yeah.
right? So if you go back to 2008 or
Mm.
even a little before that, before Pluto went into Capricorn, like I can only speak from my experience, but you know, our age group was like at the end of high school, beginning of college, around that transition, and like we made these decisions in air quotes about where we were, what we were going to do with our lives, where we were going post childhood, based on a societal framework that we could not have imagined at that point would be in the fucking state and shambles that it's in now,
Yes.
right? And
Yeah.
so that's the kind of change. And I'm sure like my experience of that, our experience of that is particularly visceral because that shift happened as we were becoming adults, right? Like
Yes.
as we were entering the societal structure.
Yeah.
That's Pluto and Capricorn sextile Pluto and Scorpio. So there was a
Mm.
collaboration happening, you know,
Hmm.
that changed us.
Yeah.
Um, but anyways, like looking at that, sorry, I didn't complete the thought. It's a particularly visceral shift for us, but I think that there were reverberations that maybe not in it quite as formative ways, but still affected and showed people across demographics, across Pluto placements and age groups, what we were taking for granted about what we just understood physical structures in society to be,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
and we don't take that shit for granted anymore. Like, even if
Mm.
you want to, you can't, right?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter people's political ideology, people's level of awareness or awakeness. Like, it's getting very hard to ignore
Mm.
that the system that we once thought was the end all be all that would be here our whole lives will not be. right?
Yes.
And so that level of total decimation and change and
Mm,
unveiling in
mm,
Aquarius to me looks like we have no fucking idea how reality works,
yeah.
right? Because now it's still Saturn, so it's still based on our concept of reality, but not physical reality, intellectual reality, science,
Mm,
mind, theory,
yeah.
right? So I just part of me thinks I'm being a little bit like accelerationist, wishful thinking, cross of upheaval because change is always a little like more slower and day to day and mundane than my like fire airy self tends to associate it. Maybe, I don't know. But also I look at the astrology and I tune into what's happening and I'm like, no, yeah, shit, paradigmatic shift is like
Mm,
in motion now.
for sure. For sure. Yeah.
Fun.
Fun.
So yeah,
Okay.
so that's like a huge undertone of far beyond 2025. Um, and yeah, I think we probably could speak to like the Aquarius Aries sextile in that and the Chiron Pluto component, but you already kind of did. So yeah, should we move on?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay.
So the next one we have is Neptune, which um, will enter Aries on March 30th this year, which is crazy because right now we're speaking and it's February 9th. I'm not sure when this episode's going to come out, but it's like basically in less than 2 months.
Yeah, 2 days after my birthday.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
So it's in my
Um,
return chart. Fun.
yep, yep. So one thing to note maybe here is that in July, Neptune will retrograde, right? And then it will re-enter Pisces on October, sometime in October. So it's not like a full on, Neptune is not solidly in Aries, right? But it is a huge shift, and um, I guess let's do it how we've been doing the other planets. Like when I think about Neptune, I think about some of the words that came up were dissolution. Neptune to me has to do with the dissolving of boundaries, right? Neptune um, is is about people often think about Neptune as like this kind of hazy, chill, vibes only force, but in my own personal experience, Neptune transit, like when Neptune was transiting my sun, nothing else was like it. Like
Yeah,
it was
it's
so
like
ferocious.
vibey, yes. Chill, no.
No.
Like when the boundaries between dimensions get blurred,
Yeah.
you're not chilling. It might look, maybe it
No.
looks to the outside
Yeah.
like you're chilling, but that is not what's happening. Yeah.
Yes, yes,
Sorry to
exactly.
interrupt. That's just
No.
such a good point about Neptune.
Yeah. So I think, especially when we're thinking about it in terms of 2025 in general, Neptune transits can be violent, and Neptune transits can be really taking everybody off guard, and Neptune to me is also like the dissolving of the center, the dissolving of like that which we've been grounding into.
Mm.
Um, I'm actually. It's funny. I want to bring in the work of one of our colleagues here because when I think about Neptune and Aries, I just keep thinking about Leah Garza and a lot of her work with decoloniality and with thinking about ontology. This idea, so Leah is a decolonial scholar, an Akashic practitioner, um, which already, if you think about it, like decoloniality and Akashic work is very like Neptunian in some ways.
Hmm.
And she's also an Aries sun.
Yeah.
Um, this idea of like the dissolution of reality, right? The idea of using our imagination to chart our path forward. The idea of the path being made as we walk to me is really alive. And then I also think there's some connection here with Pluto and Aquarius and Chiron and Aries because um, something that came up or came forward for me when I was thinking about Neptune and Aries is this idea of what even is an individual.
Mm.
We've kind of had this definition of what it means to be an individual, or what an individual means. And recently I got into this conversation with a friend about, the empire and US foreign policy and things like that. And I was talking about, people right now in February 2025 are talking a lot about like fearing that their rights are being taken away from them. But one of the things I always say is, if you want to see how much the government really care about your rights, look at the incarcerated and look at how they treat their neighbors, because that's going to tell you a lot about what the government actually believes, right? It's one thing to be treating paying taxpayers, like functional taxpayers who are basically making the government a lot of money. It's one thing to be treating these people with dignity and respect. It's another thing to see what values the government really holds when you look at people who are the most enfranchised, right?
Mhm.
Um, I also think with Neptune moving from Pisces to Aries, there's a theme here I'm picking up around putting famous people, putting government, putting ideology kind of off the pedestal.
Mm.
When I was reflecting on this, I was like, oh, reality, show me an example of Neptune in Aries. And then I opened Instagram and I found this video of this guy who was narrating this elaborate made up theory on why Blue Ivy Carter didn't stand up to hug Beyonce when she won Album of the Year. And then somebody left this comment, Kelsey, that I thought was so Neptune in Aries. Somebody said, people be writing another person's whole life script, forgetting their own life. It's really fascinating. So I think this whole idea of like, oh, actually, these people that we've put on a screen, right, like behind this projection field are also people. And they're really just our reaction to them, our comparison, our um, stories about them are really just telling us more about ourselves and the state that we're
Mhm.
currently in.
Mm.
Um, I don't know. I'm curious about what you think, and I know I'm probably not doing a great job talking about the movement from Pisces to Aries, but um, yeah, I'm curious what's coming up for you, Kelsey.
You are doing a great job. I struggle with Neptune. I
Mm.
don't know what it like. Neptune is so elusive to me
It
that
is.
I'm constantly like, wait, what is it? Wait, where is it? Wait, what's happening? And so like I've not consciously experienced a Neptune ingress as an astrologer. Do you know how
Mm.
long Neptune was in Pisces? I mean, as far as I can consciously perceive, it's like just forever. Like
I can double check. Yeah.
it's a quality of reality that I take for granted,
Yeah.
partially because it's Neptune and it's
Yeah.
elusive, but partially because it's all I know, as an
Hmm.
astrologer and an adult.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't even, the fact that I can't even place when it entered roughly also
So
feels very in.
Neptune was last in, like, solidly entered Pisces on February 2012.
Okay.
Mhm.
So almost as long as Pluto was in Capricorn, if you
Yeah.
zoom out. So
Yeah.
yeah, um, the stuff that was like really that piqued my interest, and I really didn't try to conceptualize Neptune and Aries much because of what I've already said, and also because you generously offered to introduce it. So I was like, we'll see what that brings up for me. But the stuff that like pinged me was this question of like what even is an individual? Like
Mm.
that really made me sit up straight.
Yeah.
Um, and then also the the dissolving of center stuff and the stuff that you kind of ended on with like depedestalizing certain individuals was really interesting to me, in particular because Neptune has a lot to do sometimes with like the zeitgeist, like what is the
Mm.
collective glamorizing
Hmm.
at any given time. And with Neptune and Pisces, like for me, because I'm a kind of a linear thinker with my left consecutive brain and my left mind as well, like it always helps me to feel into what the next transit is by like kind of linearly trying to understand what the last one was and then
Mm.
feeling into how that might lead to the next, right? So
Mhm.
with Neptune and Pisces, there was this like real glamorization and popularization of spirituality,
Mm.
right? Like
Mhm.
astrology, tarot, mainstream, even human design, this weird fucking thing,
Yeah.
so esoteric,
Yeah.
not mainstream, but like, I mean, my neurotypical normie family members know what it is now because it's me, you know, and like people on the internet who are not that there in these other dimensions with us are talking about human design
Mm.
too, you know, and obviously like capitalism got its dirty hands on astrology and tarot and stuff, and there's all these apps out there.
Mm.
And it's like, yeah, uh, corporations use astrology and the zodiac to try to like do cute, kitschy ads, you know, so just this
Yeah.
real mainstreamization, glamorization, romanticization of some of these Piscean ways of looking at reality.
Mhm.
Um, and it's interesting because with Neptune, I'm always like, there's always this contradiction that shows up for me of like,
Mm.
it's an illusion and a disillusion. So it's like
Mm.
there's something about it that I haven't been able to quite articulate yet that's like it shows us where we've been disillusioned and it shows us the illusion, but it also creates another illusion.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like
It's a hall
it's
of
a
mirrors.
yeah, so it's like ontologically speaking, it is like showing us what we kind of had wrong but also putting a new fog in front of us. So it's
Yeah.
like becoming more clear by becoming more foggy. Yeah, a hall
Mm.
of mirrors. Like there's
Mhm.
no clarity.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so like seeing the way that we celebrate individuals, I really like that as a theme for how it might show up. And it makes sense a lot if you look at US politics, right?
Mm.
Like what the fuck are we doing? Like,
Yeah.
even just with the concept of like the president and the two-party system and like, you know, the way the left experienced some disenfranchisement with Kamala not being a voted in primary candidate, you know, and
Mm.
I think maybe the right is experiencing that. And I like barely pay attention. So I
Mhm.
think I'm like kind of feel like I'm pulling this out of nowhere right now, but I think that I go on Reddit. So that's like
Yeah.
how I see what people are thinking about politics. But I
Mhm.
think the right is experiencing that a little bit with the fact that they don't feel like they elected Elon Musk. You know what I
Mm.
mean? And I don't know
Yeah.
if that's even true, but that's just kind of what's showing up for me is like
Yeah.
this glorification of individuals. And obviously, Donald Trump has been like so glorified on both
Mm.
sides of how people think of him. Like,
Mhm.
he's the cause of the no, he's not. He's not the cause of the problem. It's just a
Yep.
symptom, you know?
Yep.
So, yeah, the overemphasis on individuals, the overemphasis on individuality, maybe. But I just, yeah, I really like the question of what even is an individual because
Mm.
it fits with some of this Chiron stuff and some of this Chiron and Aries stuff and some of this like other dimensional ways of thinking about our experience of reality. Cause like I have felt so I have an early Aries stellium. So I had my like real fiery, like visceral Chiron initiation really early in the transit. And for
Mm.
me, it had a lot to do with like re-establishing a sense of um va inherent value in what Aries knows
Mm.
and like pr practicing unshaming my
Yeah.
Aries nature essentially and like
Yeah.
honoring that what Aries has to bring forth in what
Mm.
might look like selfishness
Mhm.
to some is as deeply sacred as the martyrdom that can show up in Pisces, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like air, if any sign remembers Pisces the best while acting in under for a different under different prerogative, it's Aries,
Yeah.
right? Like Aries is the next evolution of what Pisces knows. And so this question of what even is an individual is so interesting to me because if I don't even think you have to consciously be aware of this, but I just think there's something like sacred to the divine spark of Aries that is like, I'm going to separate from source.
Mhm.
I'm going to go my own way. I'm going to be a pioneer on this particular um, fractal of incarnation, and that's sacred because I know I come from this. I know I
Mm.
come from this understanding that everything is holy and everything is connected. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I just like the idea of Neptune. While in some ways it's going to depedestalize, I think it's also going to potentially rewrite, give us some
Mm.
space to rewrite the concept of what individuality is,
Yeah.
which is going to be supportive in this ongoing journey of Chiron and Aries around reestablishing a sense of like validity and sanctity in the individual
Yeah.
experience,
Yeah.
which is again sextile Pluto and Aquarius. So as we're having these ontological revelations around what we actually thought reality was, as we're
Mm.
shifting, perhaps shifting beyond or further from scientific materialism as the nexus, as the center that's getting dissolved, right?
Yeah.
Of course, that's going to play into how we understand individuality and the
Yeah.
self
Yeah.
and the nature of like projection and
Yeah.
our interconnectedness. Like that's all going to be changing.
Yeah. Yeah. As
But
you're
and it's
speaking,
all, sorry,
go ahead.
last thought, it's all fire and air. So it's
Mm.
not changing in form,
Yeah.
right? Like our
Yeah.
physical experiences don't have to be what prove these shifts to us,
Mm.
and they're not going to be necessarily where we see the shifts take place.
Yeah.
So to me, that's a huge quality of 2025, all in all, is like these are not Earth transits.
These are
So
not
these
Earth
shifts are
transits.
not necessarily changing the physical experience we're having, but there's still
Yeah.
something massively mutating in our experience on a spiritual and intellectual level.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I'm thinking about how even the idea of individuality as, I'm going to generalize here, as a lot of people understand it and live it and embody that in the US, to me, doesn't necessarily point to that, and I think we can see places in how we've designed like a whole society that actually shows us that we don't believe in like true individuality, right? Like
Right.
we have a really hard time understanding or accepting that another person might have a very different experience than us,
Mm. Hmm.
and um like
Mm.
even thinking about things like racism or like transphobia is really rooted in like people being like, yeah, but well, I don't want to change my gender. It's like, yeah, just because that's not part of your experience doesn't mean it's not a part of the human experience, right? and
Yes.
and then to think that we have like a government or we have these governing bodies that make up these rules, um, without really honoring the truth of the individual means that we don't actually believe in
Yeah.
individuality. We don't actually
Amen.
believe in individuality. And I think Neptune and Aries is going to show us that maybe the problem is not individuality, but the problem is we don't believe enough in the individual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Neptune and Pisces, maybe we saw like kind of a disillusionment with world religions,
Yeah.
and like spirituality kind of took on a
True.
new
True.
something. And
Yeah.
so like we'll have maybe like a divestment, disillusionment with the last conceptualization of what individuality means.
Mm.
And like, yeah, oh gosh, I love that point you made. Like, I don't think we get individuality. I think even just like it's one of those words. I had this moment with community a few years ago and had a whole thesis statement project on how we need to stop just using the word community without defining it. I'm
Mm.
feeling that way about the concept of individuality right now because it's like I think what we're actually referring to like in the West and in the States when we say individuality is like suffering through homogenization alone,
Yes.
right? Like
Yes.
that's what we value and prioritize in the US too much. But when I see people who seem to be like allies to my causes, people in my 11th house preaching that we need to help each other, we need to like we're how we get us out of this and like community is where it's at. There's a little bit of me that's like there's just a little bit of me that is afraid that we're jumping to that part without transmuting
Mm.
this Chiron and Aries shit, without like
Yeah.
calibrating back to self as a means for how we're going to help each other.
Mm.
And so I think we have an aversion to the concept of individuality because of the homogenized dictate that we must suffer alone through this thing that actually does not in any way value
Yeah,
individualism. So when you and I are
exactly.
talking about individuality, we're talking about differentiation, right? Like we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about honoring the sanctity of separateness. We're talking about honoring the choice on this dimension to incarnate as separate entities and have our own experience. In my mind, again, metaphorically speaking, because this isn't quite actually linear to me how I conceptualize it, but so that we can then take our individual experience and assimilate it back into the encyclopedia of cosmic collective consciousness truth, right? We don't
Yes.
get to do that if we're I mean, I guess we get to do it. But like we don't have to hate it. We don't have to suffer through it.
Yeah.
So yeah, you just really opened something up for me around what do we even mean when we say individuality? Because it like hurts me when I hear allies talk about hyper individualism and how we're so obsessed with it in the West and we're obsessed with it in the States because we're actually not. We're not embracing individuality correctly or
No.
enough from where I
No.
stand. We're
No.
embracing a dictate that we must suffer through homogenization alone.
Yes. Correct. I saw an article on Substack. I forgot the name of the writer, but this person was talking about how um, people have been misunderstanding the entirety of what Carl Jung was saying when he was talking about the ego. Because essentially, what Carl Jung was really saying was strengthen the ego so you can release your grip. You know,
Mm,
your
mm.
belief that you need to be gripping on your ego to survive. You know,
Yes.
but that process of strengthening the ego first is often necessary before the ego death.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And also, like, bringing it back into spiralic and nonlinear, like, I've been through so much fucking ego death. And I feel like I'm in a position right now where I better start fucking embracing my ego again, or I'm literally going to disappear. You know, in a way that's like that I don't need to do and that doesn't actually serve anyone, right? Like I'm in a
Yes.
12th house year. I've been
Mm.
living on my Pluto line
Yeah.
since I moved to the desert. Like
Yeah.
I'm literally about to disappear and like there are aspects of that that have felt really supportive
Mm.
and also like I'm a fucking Aries, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm glad you brought up the ego, and I really like that distinction you made around translating Carl Jung's work around the ego
Mm.
because that when I did think into like Neptune and Aries, that was one of the like phrases that kind of came to mind was like blurriness and disillusion and re-illusion around the concept of ego and will.
Yeah.
You know, like
Yeah.
the Aries has so much to do with like asserting the self spontaneously, impulsively, according to what the will wants in that moment. I think I talk a lot about like how sometimes from the outside people see Aries placements as like being brave and courageous, but that what it feels like from the inside is actually having an extremely low tolerance for discomfort, like an
Mm.
extremely low tolerance for like it's like Aries, like Aries Capricorn square. Like I do not have the ability to endure
Yeah.
that which is not aligned with what I fucking want to go and where I what do I want to be feeling right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
it might look like courage, but it's actually just impatience is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I need to get
Mm-hmm.
out of this and towards what would feel better.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I don't know. I wonder if like Neptune and Aries is just going to be clarifying, like in a way, clarifying desires, but
Yeah.
also fogging
Mm-hmm.
desires.
Clarifying through fogging. Yeah.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really don't fucking know. We're gonna have to do an episode later in the year when we're in Neptune and Aries energy because it just feels so Neptunian. I feel like I'm like being tricked even trying to think about
Yeah.
a
I
Neptune
agree.
transit.
I agree.
But it is a significant, it's like half the year. That's
Mm-hmm.
big. It's not
It's
just a
big.
month or two dip, it's half the year and it's right around the corner.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
Also, I think probably we would be remiss to not mention like Aries association with war.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at 2026 and that Saturn Neptune conjunction in Aries. And,
Mm,
you know, no matter how you spin it, that transit does not look amazing.
mm-mm. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. So we'll revisit Neptune and Aries, I'm sure, as we're talking about its co-presence with Saturn, because that's
Yeah,
going to be a bit of a more tangible
yeah,
transit to talk about
yeah,
in part two.
exactly.
Do we feel complete on Neptune and Aries?
Yes. Ready to
Cool.
move on to Uranus.
Cool. Yeah. So Uranus and Gemini. Ooh, this is another one where I'm so, I remember the Uranus ingress into Taurus, and I was already an astrologer when that happened. So I'm not like as untethered from the concept of a Uranus ingress as I am to Neptune. But I'm so like Uranus and Taurus has become such a status quo of this time as well that I'm like, whoa, that's going to be a huge shift as well.
Mm, mm-hmm.
I tend to think of Uranus as like this urgent but slow burn agent of upheaval and disruption. And to me, there's like this Uranian contradiction because Uranus has this feeling like this itch, this urgency, like I'm thirsty for this change, for this liberation. But it takes 7 years to move through a sign or to move through one of our whole sign houses. And so it can feel like the metaphor I've used a million times is like I'm constantly taking layers of clothing off, trying to get free, but there's always another layer underneath.
Yeah.
Um, I really like the way Caroline Casey refers to Uranus, which is radically enlivened change. Um, Ultimately to me Uranus is about like being released from what is stagnant, so breaking through the status quo, breaking through what's been kind of holding us back. To me it's become an antidote to homogenization, like we were just talking about homogenization. Uranus is like this force within that requires us to challenge homogenization at all times. It can be associated then with both personal and societal liberation, revolution, revelation, radicalization. Uranus challenges conformity, seeks authenticity, individuality, and freedom. And Uranus has been in Taurus, fixed Earth, since uh 2018, 2019, like first dip in May of 2018 and I think final dip in 2019, final ingress. And we will still have a little bit of Uranus and Taurus in for the more than the first half of 2025 and then parts of 2026, but we experience our first little dip of Uranus into Gemini this year, 2025. So a really big year for
Mm-hmm.
Uranus.
Yeah.
I've been feeling into Uranus and Taurus. So it was, were you intentional when you offered Uranus and Chiron to me?
Yes, I
Okay,
was.
because I talk about these transits a lot. Like most of what I've been teaching for 3 or 4 years now has been a lot inspired by Chiron and Aries and Uranus and Taurus. So okay,
Mm-hmm.
thanks for that. I've been tuning into Uranus and Taurus as like this body awareness revolution.
Mm,
Um, this like kind of awakening to this revelation around what it means to trust our bodies as a guide, even just like becoming more aware of the somatic experience and how the nervous system functions. This has all felt very Uranus and Taurus to me. So we're taking these Uranian principles of upheaval and disruption and liberation, and we're accessing them through the context of Taurus, fixed
mm,
Earth, which to me that has looked a lot like upheaval, disruption, and liberation through the stubbornness of our body. So in reckoning with the capacity of our form, with the fixicity of what we have the energy and somatic resources for or not, there's like an avenue towards revolution, towards breaking free from homogenization by simply just learning and being aware of what our body needs and wants and then trusting it
mm,
as well. So like a breaking through a physical unwellness through listening to the body and how, Uranus and Taurus was trine to Pluto and Capricorn. So as like those structures were falling away, Uranus and Taurus was like giving us this different thing to feel into, this different thing to attune to, which was the body. And then with Pluto and Aquarius and like the paradigmatic shift happening, Uranus and Taurus was creating attention. And yeah, I've just seen a lot of like Uranus holding it down in Taurus and forcing us to calibrate to our concept of freedom and liberation via our individual bodies, right? Because Taurus is the first earth sign. It comes right after Aries. It's like the physical manifestation of the individual. So there's a lot of individuality present in Taurus, even though it is a Venusian sign.
Mm.
Um, it's been like a way for us to approach individuality, but on the physical form level, um, as these more societal collective paradigms and structures are collapsing, we can
Yeah.
focus on our localized experience of form. So it's been a lot of how I've been thinking about Uranus and Taurus. Um, and that's kind of, for me, the precedent to how I'm going to start to think about Uranus and Gemini and look ahead to Uranus and Gemini. So when I think about it, like what was coming through for me was we're moving from liberation through the stubbornness of form, Uranus in a fixed earth sign, the most fixed, the most earth, into liberation through the mutability of mind or through nimble mind, right? Gemini being mutable air. So I often think of mutability or mutable air as like the most mutable, the least
Mm.
dense. So it's a really big shift.
Mm-hmm.
Breaking through or liberating via multitudinous truths. Every time I think about Gemini, like I'm always kind of calling back to when we had South Node in like 2020, 2021,
Mm.
and how the South Node in Sag really showed us the effects of dogma and where each of us were dogmatic. And the
Yeah.
North Node in Gemini made like the multifaceted nature of truth and the fact that there is no singular truth kind of undeniable. And so, and the nodes to me, they're always like recalibrating. They're like helping us integrate in a more secret third way across a binary, across a polarity. So it can put us into a healthier relationship with the dichotomy of any polarity. And so I think we like somewhat recently were recalibrated on the Sag Gemini axis,
Mm.
almost like there was like a clearing, like we zeroed the scale when it came to how we understand like singular truth
Mm.
via the individual's perspective, which has value, Sagittarius, versus this like multitudinous truth that can't ever be nailed down,
Yeah.
Gemini. So there's something about like we'll access our freedom or we'll approach freedom and liberation and authenticity in this next 7 year Uranus transit on the plane of mind. One way I phrase that as well is possibility becomes the terrain for
Mm.
liberation.
Mm-hmm.
I have Jupiter in Gemini natally, which is a transit that we start the year with and we've had for about a year. And for me, one way I tune into my natal Jupiter in Gemini is like possibility.
Mm.
Gemini feels very meaningful and purposeful to me, and it grounds me and it centers me. So I think
Mm.
there's something with possibility feeling really relevant in how we access revelation and revolution with Uranus and Gemini. Refusing commitment is another phrase that kind of came up, which, as I'm thinking about that in regards to like US politics, like no longer just aligning oneself with a political affiliation, perhaps.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I also, the phrase revelation and revolution are homeless came up for me, like
Mm.
Taurus being really, really about our physical experience of place and locality and form,
Yeah.
and Gemini being like kind of outside of place. So I was somewhat inspired by something that Hawk put in their stories. Hawk
Mm-hmm.
Astrology, I think, is how you find Hawk on social media, about the Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius marking did you see this?
I did not.
Okay. Marking like the shift into the air era out of the earth era. And Hawk was kind of deciphering this according to like our relationship to social media in a way, and how even social media, which is this very, or the internet in general, which is this very airy, not earthy thing in the age of
Mm.
earth, it still was very much about place. Right,
Mm-hmm.
like we had these places we went to online, our
Yeah.
websites, our blogs, our Instagram feeds,
Yeah.
and we even would expect like on our Instagram feeds to see the people that we followed, right? And
Mm.
everything is so much more algorithmic now and advertisement prone that like
Mm-hmm.
I can't ensure that if I want to see Jonathan when I go online, I will. Right? Like
Exactly.
things feel so much more scattered.
Yeah.
So that's been in my mind a lot after listening to that. I wish Hawk would put that in a permanent form. Maybe I will suggest that to them. because it was just an Instagram story.
Mm.
But that, like, I was thinking, I think that was influencing how I was thinking of Uranus, where it's like Uranus and Taurus. Like, oh, I remember. Oh, wow. Okay. I remember before the Ingress listening to the astrology podcast. This was like 7 years ago. And one way that Austin Coppock talked about Uranus and Taurus was like, or maybe this was after the ingress because it sounds like it might have been a COVID
Mm.
thought. But
Mhm.
to show up in person is revolutionary. I
Yeah.
remember hearing Austin say something like that.
Yes.
And I just, yeah, so I just can't, I can't move. This thought keeps popping into my head around Uranus and Gemini, where like the revelation and revolution become homeless. It's outside of place, it's
Mm.
outside of time. It
Yeah.
exists in many places at many times, and
Yeah.
it's trine Pluto in Aquarius, right? So once we experience this Uranus and Gemini shift, the prerogative of Pluto in Aquarius, which is to decimate what we think we know, like this massive paradigmatic unveiling, will support and naturally harmonize with and feed off of both ways the prerogative of Uranus and Gemini, which I
Yeah.
don't feel as certain for myself of what the prerogative of Uranus and Gemini is, but I know the prerogative of Uranus in general is to set ourselves free, but also through, innovation, through authenticity
Mm.
and scientific advancement, right? That's also a delineation of Uranus. If we think about the myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods to bring to the humans. But anyways, yeah, it just feels like this when it's difficult for me to think of them separately,
Mhm.
Pluto and Aquarius and Uranus and Gemini, but
Yeah.
they echo and they amplify each other's um highlighting maybe or like re uh emphasis on um, these massive changes happening in this very ethereal, not tangible, not dense realm of mind.
Agreed.
So it's like through intellect, through the nimbleness of mind, through the mutability of mind, through perception, and both the trickery and the magic of perception
Mm.
and perception shift.
Yeah.
This is where change and this is where liberation, revelation, revolution will be taking place.
Yes. As you're speaking, Kelsey, I'm thinking of something I thought about a lot when I was first learning astrology, which was the combination of fixed signs and or the trine between a fixed sign and a mutable sign. It's kind of like remix in music.
Mm,
You know, it's basically using the same material but reordering them and changing our relationship to them in such a way that shifts our whole entire perception of them, right?
cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's interesting as you're speaking about Uranus and Gemini being impacted or impacting maybe even Pluto and Aquarius. I think it is going to bring a more dynamic dance to that revolution. Like when you were saying revelation and revolution are homeless, that really kind of struck me. And it's also making me think about how we often, when I think about Gemini, I think about um, options as well. But if Libra is about choosing the options, Gemini is more about appreciating the options. Like this
Mm-hmm.
entire Jupiter in Gemini transit for me has been around like I don't really know what to do with all these options, but thank fucking God I have options.
I love that. Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Okay. So Uranus in Gemini, then this, like, I called it revolution through possibility, but revolution through options. So again, kind of
Mm,
coming back to that non-committalness. Like, we don't
yeah.
have to do it that way.
Yeah.
We could do it
Yeah.
this way or this way or this way or this
Yeah.
way or this way.
Right.
And that like is kind of ungrounding and disorienting as we know, can be a quality of Gemini.
Yeah.
But there's magic in that. And yeah, I think probably Jupiter and Gemini has prepared us in some ways to appreciate, to
Mm-hmm.
have gratitude for the magic of that mutability.
Yeah.
It is destabilizing, but like, don't we want to feel destabilized right now from a past version of air quote stability that we've
Mm,
now unveiled the toxicity,
yeah.
the rot in it. So we
Yeah.
want that destabilization.
Yeah.
And we can even look at like Uranus and Taurus and Jupiter and Taurus, which we also had recently as like these transits that prepared us to be able to physically handle the
Mm.
destabilization to come.
Mm-hmm.
This is also the US's Uranus return,
Mm.
right? So
Yeah. Oh,
I
yeah.
haven't put a whole lot of thought into what that means. Like I found myself in the last couple days looking ahead to this conversation, feeling into how I'm translating Uranus and Gemini for myself and then trying to find that in the essence of the US.
Mm.
And I was kind of struggling a little bit. So maybe that'll appear to me at some point. I haven't like studied the chart of the US all that much, but
Yeah.
like I can think of the US as a Cancer Sag rising and like I got that. I
Mm-hmm.
struggle a little bit to feel into what the US's essence as a natal nation, Uranus and
Uranus and
Gemini
Gemini.
is.
Yeah.
But then I think about the US Revolution, which you noted
Mm.
was Pluto at Aquarius, right? The US has Pluto in Cap in its chart, but we actually, um, I guess, like completed the
Yeah.
revolution with Pluto in Aquarius
Yeah.
and Uranus and Gemini. So just kind of the idea of like, I don't want to be committed to that,
Mm.
that being the US's history as under the territory, under the government, under the dominion of Great Britain.
Yeah.
Right? So that
Yeah.
again, that like revelation through possibility, like what if? You know,
Mm.
I
Mm-hmm.
wrote a song for every sun season a few years back, and the Gemini song, it's not called What If, but like the main lyric in the chorus is What If. Like every line
Mm.
starts with What If.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Gemini energy to me. What
Yeah.
if? So accessing like deeper freedom, bursting through the chains, taking off these layers of homogenization through just entertaining the notion of what if.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 I feel like as someone who didn't grow up in the US, I came here when I was 17.
Mhm.
Um, I do feel like the US as a nation or as maybe an idea, as a people is very Uranus and Gemini in many ways. This whole rhetoric around, building walls and kind of kicking out immigrants. I mean, if we were to kick out all the immigrants in the US, we would have nobody because everybody was an immigrant here. We
Mhm.
would have the Native Americans. That would be it. And
Mhm.
and I think there is something about uh the idea of it's interesting. I recently was talking about was talking to my um hairdresser who is from Japan, and he mentioned something about how much he loves living in New York and in the US because it's so diverse. Like he was like, oh, there are people from all over the world.
Mhm.
There's a lot of different cultures. And I think, throughout this conversation, we've been talking about the empire and we've been talking in ways that are probably pretty um, critical to the US. But I do think, I mean, there was a reason why I moved to the
Mhm.
US. Like I do think that there's a lot of incredible things about the culture.
Mhm.
There's that there's a reason why the US has become kind of the hotbed for a lot of different innovations,
Yeah.
right? That we've seen in the past century. Other than the fact that the US has placed itself as a political superpower, I think there's something more profound going on. I think there is something
Mhm.
about the spirit of innovation, the spirit of what else is out there, the spirit of
Wow.
exploration. I've been thinking a lot about David Lynch, actually, who passed away earlier this year. And David Lynch is such a great example of an artist who grew up with parents who would take their children's interests seriously, right? Like he grew up with parents who, like, if he wanted to learn harmonica, would buy him a harmonica, right? Rather than thinking of Gemini is also associated with children, right? Rather than thinking of a childish impulse or a childlike impulse as childish, what if we take the childlike impulse as holy?
Mhm.
And to me, Uranus and Gemini carries that possibility.
Yes. Wow. That's amazing. And so the Uranus return, I'm just like really appreciating and soaking in this recalibration to like, wait a minute. there's a facet of the American spirit
Mm.
that doesn't need to be condemned.
Yeah.
Um, perhaps, maybe,
Yes.
possibly doesn't need to be fully and unilaterally condemned. Thank you for that. And I like what a great point. Your experience of the US as someone who immigrated to it, like
Mm.
that is the Uranus and Gemini spirit. And I'm thinking now of this like the just the possibility, the way that people when immigration was happening at the inception of the United States, it was so much about the new world, the
Mm.
possibility. And we know now that there's a lot of problematic way, like that's colonization, right?
Mhm.
Um, and that spirit is still relevant. And so I'm
Yeah.
thinking about like the US Uranus return maybe being about like as a nation, as a people, reestablishing that spirit. Like you
Mm.
were saying, a parent taking a child's artistic impulse seriously, but like as a nation, us taking our impulse to explore possibility and revolution and revelation through possibility, through
Mhm.
options, through like reimagining, through these like perspective shifts seriously.
Yep.
And I
Yep.
think that is what's going to happen. And I don't know if we're on the timeline where it ends in like civil war.
Mm.
I don't know, but I think something that does feel true to me is that there's like, or does feel maybe most probable to me, is that there's this undertone. And I always talk about it as like divestment, there's this
Mm.
undertone of divesting from the old narrative and the old paradigm, so that even if we see this fascist authoritarian takeover that we're
Yeah.
seeing,
Yeah.
not if, right?
Yeah.
That it doesn't necessarily have to be indicative of where the power actually lies, because there's this simultaneous divestment
Yeah.
happening through the minds, right? Not Earth, but Aquarius and Gemini,
Mm.
air through the minds,
Mhm.
and Aries through the spirit, the individual spirit. There's a divestment from those structures that honor those that power anyways.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah, another, I guess I'm starting to tap into how Uranus and Gemini is a part of that story.
Mm.
It's through like reinvesting in possibility, reinvesting in options
Yeah.
that are not a part of the plane on which the autocracy is rising.
Yes, yes. And inventing those options too, right? The other day I was talking to a friend who expressed rightfully, that they were very afraid for abortion rights being taken away. And what I was telling them was, well, if you look at it from a more international perspective, if you look at other nations, right? There are so many other countries and governments where abortion is illegal, and yet people are still doing it because
Right,
people create networks of mutual care, and there are
right.
people doing incredible work kind of under um, under the table. And I think
Yeah.
this more trickster, one thing we didn't talk about with Uranus and Gemini is it's a Uranus that is responding to Mercury, the trickster, right? And I think divesting from believing that the only path is kind of the quote unquote legal path, especially
Mhm.
if the government is the way it is, right? Like
Yeah.
then we can see what other options are out there, and um the other day I found this thread that someone was writing about the revolution in Taiwan. I don't have all the different details in my brain right now, but this person was talking about the ways in which, earlier in the 20th century, how Taiwan ended up becoming a country, and it was through the revolution of everyday people. It wasn't this huge, leader, right? Kind of leading the mass, Exodus
Hmm.
style out of an oppressive Chinese government. It was basically a network of people helping one
Hmm.
another out, and
Yeah.
I think there are so many examples of those. And 20th century, like Americans who were born in the 20th and the 21st century, have never really had to look at examples outside of the US because there is this illusion that's been created, right, in the zeitgeist of the American people that America is the center of the world. But actually, if America and the American people see themselves as part of this greater web of kin, I think there's so much more options available
Mhm.
all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, um, yeah, Uranus and Gemini. I don't have the words for it, but something very, yeah, the Neptune and Aries, Uranus and Gemini combo of like, as you said, dissolving the center
Mm-hmm.
of America's own ego.
Yeah.
But yeah, then also not just not America's own ego identity, but then also, yeah, I don't know how that applies on like the world stage
Mm.
necessarily, but I guess America, because it's because of this illusion of it being the center, which
Mm.
is totally an ego thing, and then you're saying like this illusion has in some ways trickled into outside of America too, right? It's like this worldwide maybe bursting of the bubble of
Yeah.
America's ego inflation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm looking forward to it.
Mm-hmm. On that note, does that feel complete to you,
I think
Kelsey?
so. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
we set a very thorough foundation tone of the foundation of these outers. Yeah, and it'll
I
be
agree.
cool to talk about maybe. Well, I'm like like the intention is in a maybe more tangible way, but who knows? There's a couple like alien fifth line people, the Pisces Sun, Pisces North Node. It might be just as spacey in part two, but
Mm-hmm.
at least we'll have offered listeners the opportunity to ground into some of our spacey contextualizations of these thick undertone chords. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
super cool. Thank you. This was
Thank
awesome.
you. Thank you, Kelsey. This is so inspiring to speak with you.